Our next artist is Harry Fenn. Harry Fenn was born in the London borough of Surrey on September 14, 1837. He showed an early aptitude for drawing and was apprenticed around the age of 14 or 15 to the leading engraving firm in London. In the winter of 1857, at age 19, Fenn, along with another apprentice, left to visit Canada and America, most specifically Niagara Falls, which was considered America's premier natural attraction at the time. He may have been influenced on seeing Frederick Edwin Church's painting Niagara, displayed in London during the summer of 1857. This painting is considered to be the first instant success of the Hudson River School. It is also considered by many to be the greatest painting still of the falls. Fenn stayed in America and worked as an engraver in New York while taking art classes. By mid-century, New York was the largest city in America with 500,000 people, and the printing publishing business was its fastest growing industry. This was a time of great economic expansion, a more educated public, and technological breakthroughs that lowered the cost of printing publications. Harry had arrived in New York at the perfect time. During the Civil War, the public had grown accustomed to seeing illustrations of recent events. The demand for engravers and illustrators was increasing. In 1838, the estimated number of engravers was 20. By 1870, there were about 400. Fenn worked as an engraver in the early years for both Frank Leslie Illustrated Newspaper and Harper's. He lived in Brooklyn as a boarder at the home owned by the parents of Mary Thompson, who he would marry. In 1863, Fenn began his career as an illustrator or designer and continued to pursue his interest in watercolor painting. Fenn was the sole illustrator for John Greenleaf Whittier's book, Snowbound, one of the earliest illustrated gift books produced in America. This work established Fenn's reputation as an artist and illustrator, and he was in high demand thereafter. After the Civil War ended, the Transcontinental Railroad expanded, opening up the West, and there was a great interest in exploring the North American continent. Art historian Barbara Novak has written about artist explorers, and Fenn falls into this area. Here we see a self-portrait of the artist on the move, with his portfolio under his arm. He's got long hair, a wide handlebar mustache, and a feather on his hat, dressed for travel. He's looking out the back of a swiftly moving train, as indicated by the smoke coming from his mouth and pipe. You can see he's a bit of a celebrity. The difficulty in getting to some of these places was fascinating to the public, and the press reported on their comings and goings. Appleton's Journal began a series known as Picturesque America in 1870. The United States was still recovering from the ravages of the Civil War, and up until this time, most illustrations of America were from the New England region. Picturesque America allowed people to conceptualize the country as a whole and incorporate areas they had never visited or seen images of before, including the reunited South and the newly explored West. Darwin's Origins of Species had come out in 1859. There was a lot of interest in this time in natural history and geological tourism. There was also a public and critical demand that American publications use American artists and engravers as opposed to just recycling images from Europe. So within a 2-year time, Appleton's went from reusing imported images to original American designs. Fenn would be the most prolific contributor to Picturesque America, but other artists were hired, including Granville Perkins and Winslow Homer, who are also represented in the Risner Fine Art Collection. Picturesque America announced from the beginning the intention to show, quote, the most unfamiliar and novel features of American scenery, end quote. Fenn's first trip for the series was to Florida, which in 1870 had a population of around 188,000 people. In August 1870, he traveled by steamboat up the St. Johns and Ocklawaha rivers, accompanied by writer T.B. Thorpe. These river routes had only recently been made accessible by the steamboats. Fenn created 12 Florida scenes for this first series. Swamps were viewed as unhealthy, but Fenn connected them to the picturesque aesthetic, which is characterized by irregular form, rough texture, pleasing variety, contrast of light and dark, associated with ruins or gnarled trees, the purpose being to create interest in wood engravings were ideal with their detail to this type of approach. Fenn connected to this aesthetic through the process of growth and decay. Here you can see it in the turkey buzzards portrayed, who are waiting to consume the dead alligator at the bottom of the image. As Darwin's work and other scientific breakthroughs were discovered, the public developed a great interest in natural history and geologic tourism. Fenn had a special love of nature that bordered on the religious. He was increasingly influenced by the French Barbizon school, which used fine tones, ethereal colors, and a soft focus to bring about a sense of reverence for the natural world, a transcendence. Fenn's art was detailed, realistic, and often picturesque. Fenn was a founding member of the American Watercolor Society and painted watercolors throughout his career. He attended the second organizing meeting of the association, which was founded in 1866 and is still going strong today. After he began to work in earnest for Picturesque America, Fenn's watercolors were confined to the ones he made in the field. Fenn preferred watercolors to other mediums because they were portable. The fourth annual American Water Society exhibition in New York during the 1870-71 season listed a work by Fenn called Sketch on the Ocklawaha River. And this may have been the painting which is now in the Risner Fine Art Collection. Thorpe records that when they got to the narrow Ocklawaha River, it was lined with thick forest, creating the blackest night, and they wondered how they would be able to navigate it. The method is demonstrated in the painting. There were iron cages on both sides of the boat, and pine knots were burned to light the way. Thorpe records it created a fantastical sight, reflecting creatures' eyes staring back at them, and the trees seemed to be giant columns of Gothic architecture. Thorpe wrote, "The swamps of Florida are as rich in birds as in vegetation. It's no wonder Audubon found one of the finest fields from which to enrich his great works of natural history." He describes anhingas and cranes and alligators. And as a modern reader, I was fascinated when he described green parakeets who would make this cry at the interruption and fly off. He describes finding a Cypress-shingle yard or a camp with Florida crackers, who he describes as, quote, "civil, full of character, in their way not wanting in intelligence. How they manage to survive the discomforts of their situation is difficult to imagine, but they do exist. The mosquitoes drawing from their bodies every useless drop of blood. The low swamp malaria making the accumulation of fat an impossibility, while the dull surroundings of their life, to them most monotonous, cramp the intellect until they are almost as taciturn as the trees with which they are associated." This watercolor Fenn produced from the trip is not in the Risner collection, but belongs to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The series became subscription-based, and when people had collected a certain number, they mailed them back and had a range of cost options for binding, which became a 2-volume set bound in leather. Picturesque America had a great influence on the American public, fostering unity and pride in the country, as well as supporting the growing historic preservationist movement. Fenn traveled America and the world extensively, creating images for these books. Also, unlike Audubon's exorbitantly expensive books, families of moderate means could afford to own these and were therefore able to become art owners. Here is an engraving from a series he did in 1872 for the city of St. Augustine. Fenn continued to paint and exhibit watercolors throughout his career. As the American art world moved further into abstraction, many Barbizon-inspired artists were forgotten, as were artists who did not work in the medium of oils. Fenn, however, through his images, participated heavily in the conceptualization of the United States as a nation, where the North and South were reconciled and the West was incorporated. Today, scholars are looking back at how these early illustrations and magazines helped shape a shared identity and constructed a national self-image. According to his biographer, Sue Rainey, he worked throughout his life and his images were published in 1912 magazine after his death in 1911. He had a prolific career. Here on the left is an image he created for the 1870 Picturesque Florida series. On the right, you can see a colorized version of the same image on Dr. Jack Davis's 2017 Pulitzer Prize winning book on the Gulf.